The bell ended classes that October afternoon. Oliver was putting his things away without much enthusiasm. This was the first year he had decided that he was too old to ask for candy, so Halloween had gone from being one of his favorite festivities to a bunch of nonsense and annoying kids throwing eggs at the houses. He was walking without much encouragement, immersed in his thoughts, when he almost bumped into Jimmy. Jimmy was a cool guy, maybe the coolest kid in town, or at least that's what Oliver thought. He hadn't been here long, but he had already shown who was boss since his first day at school. This didn't make him a bully, but it gave a message to let them know that they shouldn't mess with him. He was a year older than Oliver, so he had never had the opportunity to talk to him. Even so, he used to greet him from time to time while he watched him playing soccer. Oliver hated soccer, but when Jimmy played that sport, he was a little less hateful, especially because Jimmy used to greet him at the beginning and end of each of his games. Even with this, neither of them had ever really talked, so their only interaction were those brief seconds of each game. Jimmy smiles when he recognizes him and emphasizes that he was the match boy. Oliver just kept silent and lowered his gaze. It was something he simply couldn't avoid, even though he knew he should say something else. Jimmy was with his group of friends, who were almost as cool as he was, but the only thing he could conjugate was a simple affirmative and a nervous laugh. At the same time, he thought and reproached himself how stupid that answer was, but no matter what he thought, it was the perfect answer for Billy, who smiled back before Jose Luis interrupted them and asked Oliver if he would go out trick-or-treating with the other kids. That sounded more like a direct attack than a question, but he was quickly rescued by Billy claiming that he clearly no longer trick-or-treated, a statement that Oliver was quick to confirm, even lying that he had not done so for many years. That seemed to work and even seemed to make Oliver feel a little more confident. And without knowing when it all happened, he had agreed to go to a Halloween party. He had already heard about that party, a lot of kids in costumes at Donovan's house, which was always unsupervised. Since his father always took the night shift on Halloween, only he had never been invited. He didn't even know why he had accepted. It was more than obvious that his parents would never give him permission to go at night to the house of older kids to celebrate Halloween. But as soon as Jimmy suggested the idea, it was as if his lips had a mind of their own, and he accepted without even hesitating. And after saying goodbye, he scolded himself all the way home. He didn't know exactly why he scolded himself the most, if it was for having accepted without thinking about it, or that when Jimmy told him not to forget his costume, he only managed to answer, "Neither did you." The rest of the afternoon he was thinking of a solution. He hadn't even bothered to ask for permission. He already knew what the answer would be. With just under an hour to go before the party, Oliver had a plan. His parents never checked his room until late in the evening to make sure he was asleep. Pillows and dirty clothes under the covers would be the perfect cover. He went out the window and down the huge tree outside his room. He had no idea what exactly he would do to climb back up once he was down. He hadn't thought about going that far. He still decided to worry about it later. Shortly before arriving at Donovan's house, he remembered he didn't have a costume. He decided to just pretend he had forgotten it, but it felt even stranger to notice how he was the only one in the place without a costume. The party was full of masks of demons, witches, skulls, and specters. While he was just an ordinary boy, he was about to turn around and leave when he heard that unmistakable voice which jokingly reproached him that he had forgotten his costume. It was Jimmy, whose face was painted white with shadows in his eyes, and some bruises painted on his face and arms which looked very real. In his mouth he had some fake blood which pretended to emerge from it, and on his head he had a headband which made it look like he had a knife buried in his head. Oliver could only praise his disguise and claim that he had actually disguised himself as a homicidal psychopath, since they used to look like anyone else. But that did not end up convincing Jimmy, who, without thinking much about it, took off the headband and placed it on his head, making a joke that he was a psychopath who had received what he deserved. The night went the way Oliver expected. He was even able to fulfill the purpose he had of spending time with Jimmy. As the hours passed, most of the guests were already drunk enough to decide that it was enough to go home. Even Oliver thought about it for a moment. He had never been away from home for so long, and much less without permission. But to his surprise, Jimmy had not drunk more than a couple of beers, so he was still perfectly lucid, and he could start a conversation with him. The few that were still at the party were Jimmy's group of friends, which consisted of Emmanuel, Sandra, Agustin and Laura, as well as some other young people that he only knew by sight. All of them were having fun, and some of them were making prank calls even though Donovan had told them not to do it. But soon that atmosphere was abruptly interrupted when Donovan's father, who had not taken the night shift that night, entered the house, making everyone leave as fast as they could. While they walked through the deserted streets of the town. Oliver was together with Jimmy's group of friends and some other guys. He didn't really know, he didn't want to accept the fact that he was too scared to go home alone, so he was willing to follow any plan they could come up with until the sun came up. "This is when the butcher likes to go out," emphasized Agustin with a somewhat terrifying voice while he hugged Jimmy by the neck. All the guys laughed Oliver more nervously, but he did anyway. The only one who didn't laugh was Jimmy, who looked a little confused by the fact that they named a butcher. And as he wasn't used to be someone who was left with doubts, he asked what he was referring to. They all looked at him astonished for some seconds before remembering that Jimmy hadn't lived as long in town as them, so he surely didn't know the famous legend of the butcher of the Zarp farm, which was a legend that was always told to the children of the town so that they would behave well. There was even a rhyme about it. "In darkness you will stay, so you won't see him coming. When he is near, there is no more exit. The butcher will catch you, and with his knife, he will skin you." Still somewhat confused, Jimmy questioned what exactly it was about. Only this time he questioned Oliver, who shyly began to narrate the legend of the butcher. Nobody knew his name. Everyone simply called him the butcher. The Zarp farm had belonged to his family for generations and was located on the outskirts of town. He had no friends, only his pigs, which he was in charge of making suffer until the last day of their lives, where he was in charge of killing them to sell them to local butchers. The butcher was a bad man, and it was said that at night he could be seen doing satanic rites. It was also rumored that the meat he sold was not only pork, but this could never be proven, at least not until that Halloween night, where one of his buyers who made a delivery of meat checked it and realized that the package not only contained pork. The people of the town were totally alarmed and went to the farm where the butcher was still there. They found him red-handed, as he was dismembering the lifeless body of a man who had been missing for months, and the people proceeded to lynch him. And like a great enraged mob, they showed no mercy to the man, who was beaten again and again until his face was almost deformed. He was hanged outside his farm and skinned alive. It is said that with his last breath, he could pronounce an incantation in which he offered his soul to the devil to return every Halloween night to take revenge for what happened. When Oliver finished telling the story, the only thing that was heard was a laugh from Jimmy at the same time that he emphasized how silly and absurd that story was, seconded by the rest of his friends, and saying that it was nothing more than small-town gossip. Oliver followed the current to all that. Although inside he was really terrified, that legend had scared him all his life. If some years ago they had asked what his biggest terror was, he would have answered without a doubt that the butcher, Emmanuel, even assured that he had been to that farm 1,000,000 times, and that he had never seen anything. To which Sandra reproached him that he had never been there on Halloween night, and he had not even dared to go there at night. Everybody started to laugh at Emmanuel, to which he tried to recover his honor and proposed that everybody went to the farm. Everyone present agreed and showed genuine excitement, especially Jimmy. However, Oliver had sworn to himself that for all the gold in the world, he wouldn't set foot on the Zarp farm. But after everyone looked at him and noticed that he wasn't so sure, he ended up giving in to that social pressure. So without further delay, the young people went to the farm. Oliver found it strange that no one there really felt afraid. Or if they were afraid, they knew how to hide it very well. He felt as if his legs did not want to obey him and wanted to go the opposite way on their own. But he forced them to continue with the group. When they arrived at the farm, Oliver found it extremely disappointing. He had never even dared to approach or look from a safe distance, so he had always imagined a horrible construction full of pentagrams, inverted crosses, and for some reason he expected to see tombs. But it was nothing more than an old and very dilapidated farmhouse which was falling apart. It didn't look much different from any abandoned building. Everyone joked as they crossed the dilapidated wooden fence. This one was already a little quieter. The first place they visited was the pig pen, which, although it no longer had pigs, it emanated a nauseating smell for which none of the young people wanted to stay there for long. When they were leaving, Oliver thought he saw someone at the back of the place, but when he shined the light, he realized that there was nothing. So he continued with the rest. When they entered the barn where the butcher was supposed to take the lives of his victims, they could see on some walls circles with some strange symbols which gave a pound of being demonic and managed to disturb more than one. But Jimmy assured that probably kids like them had painted them to try to scare those who came to go. That explanation was enough for Oliver, who by that time felt almost as brave as any of them. The tour was becoming more and more boring and disappointing. Nowhere were the meat hooks where the legend assured that the butcher hung his victims still alive, and neither were the old, huge, rusty knives with which he used to take the life of his pigs. One of the boys, whose name was unknown to him, lit an old metal can which contained many papers and wood, which made it light up very fast, and for some hours they simply stayed by the fire talking about trivial things and one or another horror story. Oliver, that was the best night of his life. He was enjoying it more than the party itself, especially because Jimmy had stayed with him all the time. He had even given him his home number so they could talk on the phone, totally immersed in the conversation with Jimmy. He didn't even notice when almost everyone present had gone to explore on their own, leaving only the two of them, and Agustin, who got up to go pee. Both continued with their conversation until after 30 minutes, where nobody came back yet. When Oliver questioned where everyone was, Jimmy insinuated that most probably they were in some corner kissing. This made Oliver nervous. Even more when their eyes met. Jimmy smiled at him. It was almost as if he could read his mind. It was as if he knew that secret that he had never told anyone. As he slowly approached him, he felt his heart going 1,000 per hour. He couldn't believe it was happening. He closed his eyes and felt Jimmy's lips brushing against his. Oliver wished that moment wouldn't end. But just when Jimmy's watch marked 3 a.m., a scream made them alert immediately. It was a heartbreaking scream of a girl. They both got up from the floor. For Oliver, there was no doubt that they should run away. But Jimmy had completely different plans. He started to walk towards where he believed the scream came from, claiming that they should help. Oliver didn't know what to do. If someone needed help, the best thing would be to go to the police and not to go deeper into the farm. Even so, he knew that Jimmy would not understand those reasons, and he did not want to go all the way to the exit in complete darkness, so he decided to go after him. Both were walking down one of the long and dark corridors when a shiver ran through their bones when they heard 2 more screams, which even for Jimmy were terrifying. Both boys stepped back a little, trying to find out exactly where the screams were coming from, trying to be the calm one of the two. Jimmy decided to continue walking. He pushed open one of the old wooden doors, and what he saw behind it was extremely shocking for both of them. Behind the door were all the knives and meat hooks that a few hours ago they complained of not seeing. In the same room were all their friends who were lifeless. Oliver watched as Agustin had a butcher knife buried in his head, just as his headband simulated. On an old meat hook hung one of the girls. Her eyes were wild, and a grimace of deep terror was on her face. They both ran straight to the exit. The atmosphere had become so heavy that it was difficult to breathe. It didn't take them long to realize that they were running in circles. It was almost as if they had entered a labyrinth from which there was no way out. When they were exhausted, they stopped. They knew they had passed through that room at least 3 times. It made no sense when they heard a creepy, macabre laughter, as well as the sound of something sharp carving against the walls, through a small window which illuminated the place a little bit. Oliver could see a shadow of what seemed to be an adult man. The closer he got, the laughter also increased. They both ran back to where they thought this time was the exit, returning to the same place, hearing again and again. The incessant screams of their other friends mixed with that infernal laughter. They both could see that horrible shadow closer and closer. Jimmy took Oliver by the hand again. He was desperately looking for a way out. And during all that time he could not stop hearing that macabre laughter. At one point they both thought that if they could not run away, at least they could hide. They entered a small cellar where they could barely fit the 2 of them. Their breathing was agitated and Oliver was about to cry. They could still hear the laughter and the spoon carving against the walls. Oliver had no doubt that it was the butcher. Both were in that small cellar for a long time, until the laughter stopped and the passing of the minutes. Both were almost convinced that he was no longer looking for them. They even made a promise to completely burn that farm as soon as they managed to leave. Wrong was that thought, because sooner rather than later, the laughter was heard again, only this time too close, also feeling a hot and fetid breath snorting in their heads. Jimmy turned as well as Oliver, only to see with horror a man standing behind them who was smiling in a grotesque way. Letting his rotten teeth show, his face was completely covered with blood. He was wearing a butcher's apron, and in his right hand he had a huge knife which he held firmly, looking at them and laughing in the same grotesque way. The impact of seeing that horrible man made Oliver freeze, but Jimmy managed to quickly open the door and pulled him out of the cellar. They ran, but to no avail. They had no idea how to get out of there. The laughter was almost maddening. By that point, without knowing exactly how, both reached the place where they were before hearing the screams. They could still hear the laughter, which was still close by the corridor which led to the exit. It was heard closer and closer until they could visualize the butcher again. He was walking awkwardly still with that sharp knife. The smell it emanated was repulsive, almost like the pig pen. They had it in front of them. Both knew they could not do anything. The memories after that are blurry and confusing for Oliver, as he lost consciousness. When Oliver woke up, he was in the hospital. He was confused and somewhat dazed. He had no idea how he had gotten there. His mother, when she saw him wake up, almost fainted from the emotion, telling everyone that he had regained consciousness. What the police told him after being discharged. They told him that he had been the only survivor of that night at the farm, and that the only suspect was Jimmy, since he had been the only one who had not been found at the scene. Oliver tried by all possible means to say that Jimmy had not been responsible, and that he was probably still there, but nobody believed him. I was told that because he could not process everything that had happened, his mind took that familiar story that he had been hearing all his life, but that Jimmy had been responsible for everything. Now Oliver is 32 years old, and there is not a day in which he does not remember that night. His parents decided to move from that town, thinking it would be the best, and Jimmy was never heard from again. The case was closed as multiple homicide and escape. But Oliver knows that none of that is true. He remembers every moment of that night, while he looks from his car at that farm, which is even more deteriorated. He knows that evil lives in there. He is convinced that the butcher took Jimmy, and after so long, he is going to avenge him. He is going to do what he promised him. He is going to turn that damned farm into ashes.